Hey, everyone, it's Kirill here. If you're new to my channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of my stories and adventures. Today, I want to share a true-to-life tale from the United States about a woman named Julia who found herself in a startling situation after returning from a vacation. This story has it all: betrayal, family drama, and the unwavering courage of someone who refuses to be a victim. Buckle up, because things are about to get intense. When Julia Patterson moved to Seattle, Washington, she was brimming with hope for a new life. She'd grown up in a small town in Idaho, where everyone knew everyone else's business. As soon as she turned 18, she promised herself she'd carve out a path that was entirely her own. That path led her, eventually, to Michael Hutchinson. Michael was charming at first. He was the kind of guy who would surprise Julia with a bouquet of daisies just because, or show up at her work with a coffee in hand when she'd had a rough morning. But behind the sweet gestures and magnetic smiles, there were red flags that Julia, in retrospect, had chosen to overlook. When they married, Julia thought she had found her partner for life. Everyone at the wedding gushed about how perfect they looked together, while Julia's father walked her down the aisle with tearful eyes. Yet, her mother had pulled her aside that morning, whispering cautious words. "Are you sure, honey? Something about him feels off." Julia brushed off her mother's concerns. She was head over heels and believed in Michael's goodness. Over time, though, the tension began to show. Michael's mother, Barbara Hutchinson, was the type of woman who believed no woman was ever good enough for her son. A retired teacher with a knack for meddling, Barbara would drop by unannounced and question Julia's housekeeping, her meal choices, even her career. Michael often dismissed his mother's interference with a half-hearted, "You know how she is. She means well," but rarely took steps to set boundaries. Julia put on a polite face, tried to keep the peace, and told herself that Barbara's fussiness was just her way of showing she cared. 3 years into the marriage, Julia discovered Michael had been unfaithful. The revelation came one evening while she was cleaning the living room. An unfamiliar name popped up as a text on Michael's phone, which he had left charging by the coffee table. Curiosity got the better of her, and she glanced at the messages. What she found shattered her world: romantic confessions, secret plans, and even a few photos that made Julia's stomach churn. Michael's affair had been going on for months. That was the final straw. Julia confronted him immediately. He tried to deny it at first, but the evidence was indisputable. The divorce proceedings dragged out for nearly a year, draining Julia emotionally and financially. She hoped to never see Michael or Barbara again after all was said and done. In the settlement, she kept her apartment on Lakeview Drive, small but cozy, her sanctuary in the bustling city. She believed it was her chance at a fresh start, free from all the drama that had weighed her down. Yet, unbeknownst to her, not everything was truly severed. A forgotten detail, the set of spare keys she had once given Michael, would become the catalyst for another traumatic event. That lingering connection to her ex-husband was soon to rear its head in a terrifying way. Despite the heartache, Julia was determined to move on. She found comfort in traveling, a passion she'd had since her teenage years. The idea of stepping out of her daily routine, exploring new places, and immersing herself in fresh experiences filled her with hope. And so, to celebrate her new life chapter and to shake off the stress of her divorce, she booked a long weekend trip to Palm Springs, California. Little did she know, this vacation would set a series of events in motion that would bring her face to face with a reality more shocking than any betrayal she could have imagined. Julia arrived in Palm Springs with the intention of unplugging from all the chaos back home. The moment she stepped off the plane, she felt the warm desert breeze brush against her skin. She let out a sigh of relief, as if the burdens of the past year were momentarily lifted by the golden Californian sun. Her itinerary was simple: lounge by the pool, sip cold beverages, and focus on self-care. No drama, no heartbreak, just some time to reconnect with herself. Meanwhile, back in Seattle, a different story was unfolding. Michael had been staying with Barbara ever since his relationship with his mistress fell apart. His mother had let him move back into the family home, a modest, single-story house near the outskirts of the city. They both seethed with resentment toward Julia, blaming her for the broken marriage and for Michael's ongoing financial troubles. In Barbara's mind, Julia had poisoned her son's life from the beginning. Over cups of stale coffee in Barbara's cluttered kitchen, mother and son hatched a plan. Michael remembered he still had the spare keys to Julia's apartment. Barbara, always up for meddling, pressed him to do something drastic to get even. Initially, Michael hesitated. Was it really worth sinking that low? stooping to theft in an attempt to hurt Julia. But bitterness can distort a person's better judgment. Barbara fueled her son's anger by reminding him how, in her eyes, Julia had robbed him of his dignity during the divorce. She talked about the jewelry Julia was rumored to have: a set of pearls from Julia's grandmother, several expensive necklaces from traveling to Europe, and even a couple of diamond pieces she inherited from her late aunt. Barbara insisted that taking these items would be an act of poetic justice. "Mom, don't you think this is a bit extreme?" Michael muttered, though he was already picturing the glint of those diamonds. "Extreme? That woman left you without a second thought. She humiliated you during the divorce, making you look like the bad guy," Barbara snapped. "She owes you." Michael clenched his fists. He didn't appreciate being reminded that he'd been cast in the role of villain. Never mind that he'd actually cheated. Right now, all he felt was the sting of wounded pride and a craving for payback. One phone call to an old friend confirmed that Julia had indeed left town for a weekend getaway. It was the perfect opportunity. They decided on a simple plan: wait until the day before her scheduled return, then break in and grab what they could. Michael used his connections to learn which flight Julia would be on. If all went smoothly, she wouldn't know what had happened until it was far too late. However, fate rarely cooperates with ill intent. While Michael and Barbara organized their scheme, Julia was in Palm Springs feeling a strange sensation of unease. On the second day of her trip, she woke up with a nagging worry at the back of her mind. She dismissed it at first, attributing it to the residual stress of the divorce. Yet, the feeling grew stronger, culminating in a restless night where she tossed and turned in her hotel bed. Something just didn't feel right. Early the next morning, Julia decided to cut her vacation short by one day. She told herself that she simply wanted to beat the weekend rush at the airport. But deep down, she sensed an urgency to return home. It was as though her intuition was warning her of something ominous. And so, Julia packed her bags and headed to the airport, a day ahead of schedule, unwittingly setting the stage for the confrontation that was about to unfold. It was late afternoon when Julia's flight landed in Seattle. The sky was a moody shade of gray, a typical day in the Pacific Northwest. Julia hopped into a cab, gazing out the window at the familiar cityscape: the Space Needle in the distance, the constant bustle of traffic, the evergreen trees that lined the highways. She felt a twinge of relief. There was comfort in coming home, even if it hadn't fully felt like home since the divorce. When she arrived at her apartment building on Lakeview Drive, she was surprised to see no familiar neighbors around. The halls were quiet except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights. Julia ascended the stairs, keys in hand, eager to drop off her luggage, maybe unpack later, and get some rest. The first jolt of alarm came the moment she noticed her apartment door was slightly ajar. The small gap was enough to make her heart pound in her chest. She couldn't recall leaving it unlocked, let alone open. Every muscle in her body tensed, and her mind raced through the possibilities. Could she have forgotten to close it properly in her rush to the airport? Or was something else going on? Julia carefully pushed the door open. The living room lights were on, which was odd. She had turned everything off before leaving. Her heart thudded louder when she heard hushed voices coming from her bedroom. She recognized them immediately: Michael's low baritone and Barbara's sharp tone. Confusion and dread warred within her, sending adrenaline coursing through her veins. Before she could stop herself, she stepped inside. "What the hell is going on here?" she yelled, her voice echoing off the walls. She marched toward the bedroom, nearly tripping over a half-opened suitcase on the floor. Inside it, she caught a glimpse of some of her own jewelry boxes nestled among her clothes. Barbara and Michael froze like thieves caught in a spotlight. Barbara was rifling through Julia's jewelry drawer, while Michael was holding a small velvet pouch. He dropped it in shock when he saw Julia. Diamonds spilled onto the carpet, glittering ominously under the overhead light. "Julia, what are you doing home?" Michael stammered, as if he had a right to question her presence. Julia's blood was boiling. "What am I doing home? This is my apartment. The real question is, what are you two doing here, stealing my things?" She locked her eyes on Barbara, whose face was twisted with anger rather than shame. "This wouldn't be happening if you hadn't driven my son to desperation," Barbara hissed, slamming the drawer shut. "You broke his heart, humiliated him. Don't you think we have a right to take something back after everything you've put us through?" Julia's voice trembled with rage. You really think you can justify breaking into my home and robbing me? Are you completely insane? Michael stepped in, trying to calm the situation, though his words only poured fuel on the fire. Julia, let's just talk about this. Maybe we can settle things if. Settle things? You're a thief, Michael. Julia fired back. And you're involving your mother in a crime. Are you even listening to yourself? Barbara tried to seize control of the conversation. Don't talk to my son like that. You. Enough. Julia cut her off, lifting her phone. I'm calling the police, and you can explain yourselves to them. Panic flickered across Michael's face. He lunged forward, as if to grab the phone from her hand, but Julia darted away, stepping backward into the living room. In that tense moment, all three of them realized there was no easy exit from this situation. So, this is how low you've sunk, Julia said, her tone frigid. You cheated on me, lied to me, and now you're robbing me? Congratulations, Michael. You've outdone yourself. You'll regret this, Barbara spat. Mark my words, you'll regret calling the police. Julia could hardly process the venom in Barbara's voice. She fumbled with her phone, adrenaline making her fingers shaky, and dialed 911. Through the pounding of her heart, she relayed her address and the situation to the dispatcher, her voice quivering with a mixture of fury and disbelief. Michael and Barbara stood there, rooted in place, as if trying to decide whether to bolt out the door or attempt to reason with her. In the end, they remained, perhaps hoping they could beg or intimidate their way out of the consequences. But Julia's resolve was unbreakable at this point. The sound of sirens wailing in the distance drove home the gravity of what they had done. In Julia's mind, nothing would be the same again. By the time the police arrived, the entire building was stirring with curiosity. Neighbors peeked through cracked doors, whispering amongst themselves as uniformed officers escorted Michael and Barbara outside. Julia stood by her doorway, arms folded protectively across her chest. She gave the officer in charge a brief statement, explaining how she'd returned from her trip early only to find her ex-husband and his mother ransacking her apartment. Barbara was indignant, yelling about injustices and false allegations as she was led into a patrol car. Michael, on the other hand, hung his head in defeat, barely muttering any words as the officers questioned him. It was a pathetic spectacle, and Julia's heart pounded with a tumult of emotions, anger, betrayal, but also a sliver of pity. She had loved this man once, after all. She had believed in him, married him, and woven her life into his. Now, she was witnessing the final unraveling of that bond in the most painful way possible. The police spent a couple of hours documenting the scene, taking photographs, bagging evidence, and collecting Julia's statement in more detail. The apartment was a mess, jewelry boxes scattered across the bedroom floor, drawers yanked out haphazardly, clothes strewn everywhere. It made her skin crawl to think of these people going through her personal belongings with such disregard. When the officers finally left, Julia was left standing in the middle of her living room, surrounded by the tangible proof of betrayal. She could feel tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not yet, at least. First, she wanted to secure her home, change the locks, and ensure that there were no more vulnerabilities. She contacted a local locksmith, who arrived within the hour to replace the locks on her door and install new deadbolts. The handyman, noticing how shaken she was, offered a sympathetic nod as he worked. Although he didn't say much, his silent presence brought a small comfort, a reminder that there were still good people in the world. After the apartment was secure, Julia finally allowed herself to break down. She curled up on her sofa, tears streaming down her face as she replayed the day's events. The shock and adrenaline of confronting Michael and Barbara had carried her up to this point, but now the emotional floodgates opened. Anger and sadness churned in her chest. She felt violated. Her private space had been invaded. Her trust shattered yet again. Julia made a call to her best friend, Lauren, who lived across town. Lauren was outraged at the news, insisting on coming over immediately. Within half an hour, she was at Julia's side, hugging her and handing her a box of tissues. The two had been friends since college, and Lauren had seen Julia through every high and low, including her rocky marriage and stressful divorce. "Jules, I'm so sorry you had to go through this," Lauren said, her voice brimming with empathy. "I knew Michael was trouble, but I never expected he'd stoop this low. And his mother? God, she's a piece of work." Julia sniffled. "It's just, I can't believe this is happening. I thought I was finally free of him, you know? like I could move on and start over. Now I have to deal with this police report and possible court dates all over again. Lauren handed her another tissue. You'll get through this. You're strong, Julia. I've watched you rebuild your life once. You can do it again. They spent the evening cleaning up the mess and setting things back in order. Every item that Julia put away felt like a small act of reclaiming her space. With Lauren's help, she managed to restore a semblance of normalcy to her home. They checked each room, made sure nothing else was missing or damaged, and carefully placed the jewelry back in its rightful boxes. By the time they were done, they were both exhausted, but Julia felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Lauren stayed the night, not wanting to leave Julia alone after such a traumatic event. They ordered pizza, sipped tea, and talked about everything from their college memories to plans for the future. Despite the anxiety swirling inside Julia, she took comfort in the warmth of friendship. She vowed to herself that she wouldn't let Michael or Barbara have power over her anymore. Yet, a restless sleep found her that night. Each time she drifted off, nightmares jolted her awake, visions of Michael and Barbara rummaging through her belongings, sneering at her as they held her treasured heirlooms. She woke up in a cold sweat, the echoes of their voices ricocheting in her mind. The betrayal ran deep, and she knew it would take time to heal. In the following weeks, Julia took decisive steps to protect herself and seek justice. She pressed charges for burglary against Michael and Barbara. The authorities gathered evidence, including security footage from her apartment building and testimonies from neighbors who had seen the pair arriving at odd hours. Michael's and Barbara's defense was shaky at best. There was no plausible excuse for being in Julia's apartment uninvited, let alone rummaging through her valuables. Though the legal process was stressful, it also gave Julia a sense of empowerment. She met with her lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia Finch, who guided her through every step. Patricia was relentless, refusing to let the Hutchinsons slide by with half-baked justifications. During this time, Michael reached out to Julia multiple times, leaving voicemails and sending apologetic texts. In them, he claimed Barbara had pressured him into the theft. He insisted he never meant to hurt Julia. He just wanted compensation for the unfair divorce settlement. Julia deleted every message without responding. She was done with Michael, done with his excuses and his inability to accept responsibility for his own actions. Barbara was another story. She remained defiant, blaming Julia for ruining her son's life right up until the day they appeared in court. However, her self-righteous fury wasn't enough to sway the judge. The evidence spoke for itself, and both Barbara and Michael faced legal consequences. While the penalties weren't extreme, probation, fines, and mandatory counseling, they were significant enough to send a clear message: you can't break the law just to exact personal revenge. With the legal matters finally winding down, Julia felt a mixture of relief and sadness. There had been a time when Michael was someone she loved deeply. Even though their marriage had ended disastrously, she never anticipated it would degrade into criminal actions. She also felt a pang of pity for Barbara, who seemed consumed by resentment. But any empathy she had was overshadowed by the harm they had caused. In the aftermath, Julia focused on reclaiming her life. She took up kickboxing classes at a local gym to channel her stress into something healthy. She attended therapy sessions to untangle the emotional turmoil that had built up over the years, stemming from Michael's infidelity, the bitter divorce, and now this shocking incident of theft. Each session helped her sort through her fears, anger, and regrets. Lauren remained a steadfast presence, checking in regularly and inviting Julia out for coffee or walks in the park. Their friendship was a reminder that not everyone in her life would betray her. She also grew closer to some of her neighbors, who showed genuine concern and offered support during the legal proceedings. One neighbor, a retired Navy officer named Hank, even helped her install a security camera system for additional peace of mind. Bit by bit, Julia's home began to feel safe again. The once daunting shadows that lurked in every corner of the apartment receded, replaced by her personal touches: fresh flowers on the windowsill, a new rug in the living room, and photos of her travels on the walls. She learned to trust her instincts once more. The journey was far from easy, but with every day that passed, she felt more secure, more herself. When the final court date concluded and the legal issues were resolved, Julia experienced a profound sense of closure. She looked back on the roller coaster ride of her relationship with Michael, from the early days of romance to the shocking day of theft, and realized she had survived it all. She was still standing, stronger and wiser. One sunny afternoon, she sat at her dining table, sipping her favorite brand of herbal tea, and began drafting plans for her next trip. She thought of returning to Palm Springs to reclaim that sense of relaxation stolen from her by the abrupt end to her vacation. Then again, maybe she'd go somewhere completely different, New York, or maybe even a trip abroad to see the cherry blossoms in Japan. The world was wide open, and she had the freedom to go anywhere. In that moment of introspection, Julia understood that while the past had been painful, it did not define her future. Michael and Barbara's attempt to rob her of her valuables had failed, but more importantly, they had failed to rob her of her courage, her hope, and her resolve to live life on her own terms. And that, dear friends, is the remarkable true-to-life tale of how Julia came back from a vacation a day early, only to catch her ex-husband and his mother in the act of stealing from her. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to my channel and drop a like. This has been Kirill, and until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and never forget to stand up for what's right.